Friend. I'm the Executive Director of the National Building Museum, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you here for this evening's program. We here at the National Building Museum are dedicated to educating the public about the world that we build for ourselves. Our exhibitions and educational programs showcase achievements in architecture, urban planning, engineering, construction, landscape, and design. This program is just one example of how we fulfill that mission. Tonight, we'll focus on the significant but too often overlooked role of women in the architecture profession. This is the sixth such program that we've organized as part of our Women of Architecture series, presented in collaboration with the Beverly Willis Architecture Foundation to celebrate Women's History Month. On behalf of the museum and personally, I'd like to thank the foundation for its support and to its founder and our dear friend Beverly Willis, a founding trustee of this museum. We owe you a very special thanks for your continuing support of this institution over so many years. It's been wonderful. Our introduction to tonight's lecture will be given by Beverly. Beverly began her career as an architect in 1954. In 1970, after much success, Beverly complemented her architectural practice with professional organizational leadership. Among her accomplishments, she served as president of the California Council of American Institute of Architects, served on the executive committee of the National Academy of Sciences Board of Infrastructure and Constructed Environment, and of course, as I mentioned, is a founding trustee of this museum. In 2002, Beverly founded the Beverly Willis Architecture Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Beverly Willis.
Thank you, Chase, and welcome everybody. I'd like to add my welcome to Chase, and I'd like to thank you and the museum and the museum staff for this wonderful collaboration on this program and your support over the last 6 years. You know, it's really been wonderful. It's been a magnificent experience for all of us. And, you know, the idea of Women's History Month isn't that old, actually. The movement for such an occasion actually began in the 70s, and it was in 1978 that Congress finally passed legislation actually creating March as the National Women's History Month. And so it's really a great pleasure, I think, for the National Building Museum and the Beverly Willis Architecture Foundation to celebrate it together, particularly with such distinguished guests and speakers. But I would just like to read a little bit about what President Jimmy Carter said in 1987 when the legislation became signed. He said, "From the first settlers who came to our shores, men and women have worked together to build this nation. Too often, the women were unsung, and sometimes their contributions went unnoticed. But the achievements, the leadership, the courage, the strength, and the love of the women who built America was as vital as that of the men whose names we know so well." Historian Greta Lerner said, "Women's history is a women's right. It is an essential, indispensable heritage from which we can draw pride, comfort, courage, and long-range vision." And tonight, as Chase said, we're celebrating our sixth in a series of women of architecture who have actually shaped our built environment. If I can, I'd just like to say a few words about the Beverly Willis Architecture Foundation, showing about 4 slides here. The mission of the foundation is to expand the knowledge about women's contribution to shaping the built environment. And our goals are to change the historical narrative so that it includes women's work of note. And also to change the culture of the building industry so that it values the work of women equal to how it values the work of men. Naturally, it was a woman architect who conceived the idea of the National Building Museum. Clothill Woodward Smith in 1967 was hired by the General Services Administration to do a study about what should be done to this building that we're in tonight, the pension building as it was known at the time, and what should become of it. She called it a building in search of a client. And I really love the part where she talks about possible clients and impossible clients and the ideal client. And so today we have the ideal client. We research history for women architects of the past. Historian John Miller is publishing a book to be released later this year, and the book is titled The First Woman Architect, Lady Elizabeth Wilbraham, who tutored, he alleges, Sir Christopher Wren in the practice of architecture. In the U.S., we had a group of very special and important women architects who did a number of wonderful projects, starting with Louise Beth Hume in Buffalo, the Fairmont Hotel. Julia Morgan, she didn't design the first building, but when it was burned to the ground during the earthquake and fire of 1904, she designed the building that you see there now. And in the lower picture is our own Clothill Woodward Smith again. And those of you in Washington know this as Clothill's Corner. And we continue this great tradition with Annabelle Selldorf today. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce her. She is one of today's leading young architectural talents, a new star, if you will, in our galaxy of stars. She grew up in Germany and received a Bachelor of Architecture degree from Pratt Institute in New York and a Master's of Architecture from Syracuse University in Florence. She has an international reputation for her design work. She's a recipient of numerous awards, and she has significant experience in the design of museums, art foundations, collectors' homes, galleries, and exhibitions. And you can see from the slide here, she also designs tall buildings. But what makes this one special, and she'll show you the details, is that it contains a car elevator that rises from the ground to the top floor outside, allowing cars to be parked outside the condo door, whether it's on the 2nd or 22nd floor. So I find this truly amazing. So with that, I introduce you to Annabelle Selldorf.
You have Annabelle Selldorf. Good evening. very, very happy to be here. Thank you very much, Chase. Thank you, Beverly, for inviting me. It's really a great honor, and probably I should say something about being a woman architect. Often people ask me, what is it like to be a woman architect? I'm sorry, I'm sort of hearing myself. Is this it? Oh, this is better. What is it like to be a woman architect? The truth is, I have never been a man, so I wouldn't know what that's like. Turns out that I very much believe in all of the goals that Beverly has talked about, and all the more reason to say that I'm very honored to be invited to speak on this occasion. There are many problems, but also many rewards about being a woman architect, but whether that's specific to being a woman, I don't quite know. So the title of my lecture has, the title of the lecture is Architecture in Context. What that talks about is something about what are the influences in the work and what creates the context for the way we speak about the built environment. I've been thinking about the communication of ideas in architecture for some time. In fact, I think about it all the time. How is it that architects speak about their work, explain it via analyses and diagrams, and appear to be completely inevitable with their solutions? In fact, it's never really inevitable as a result of analysis. It all comes back to intuition and to a personal point of view, doesn't it? So what I thought would be a little bit interesting is perhaps to show you some images that make some of my personal history and create some of my background. It doesn't so much show you anything about what I think about the larger goals in architecture, why architecture is important in terms of where it sits in society and what the political ramifications are. But that's more than a 45-minute lecture. So, one of the first images that you see here is the casino at Schloss Glienicke Park in Wannsee, Berlin. A work by the famous architect Karl Friedrich Schinkel. Being German, you can imagine that this neoclassical architecture creates a fine background for my disciplined thinking. But what I really love about Schinkel is not so much the clarity and the discipline. What I love about the work is how it sits in the landscape and how it creates a spirit of openness vis-a-vis the culture and the civilization of its period. This is a picture of the famous Wittgenstein house. It's rather called the Stoneborough Palais by Ludwig Wittgenstein and Paul Engelmann. It was built and designed in 1926 and is obviously a precursor of the modernist movement, or rather in the early days of the modernist movement. What is interesting about it is that it was designed by a non-architect. It was designed by a non-architect for his sister, and obviously Wittgenstein was very opinionated about a lot of things. In this particular case, he claimed to be able to replace the architect. Personally, I don't think that that's possible, because I really think that architecture addresses something that's much larger than that which you can see. And in fact, however much I love this building, and one of the reasons why I like it so much is the beauty of how daylight comes into the building, the iconic quality of the windows that that support the exterior of the building. But having visited this building, what I realized is it isn't really architecture. It's a series of anecdotes that come together and they make a whole. But in my mind, even though I've used this building very much as an inspiration for many things, I think it made me think for the first time that architecture is something that is so much more than what we can necessarily just talk about. It's so much texture, it's so much civilization, culture, background, but it also addresses how to bring together disparate concepts, structure, society. How does that all hang together? Ultimately, I think it relies on a person's personal intellect and vision. Big words here, sorry. Villa Tugendhat, ultimately, the last example that I'm going to show here tonight was designed by Mies van der Rohe in Brno in the Czech Republic. It was designed in 1930 and is one of the last buildings Mies van der Rohe designed before he emigrated to Chicago. It's one of my favorite buildings, and I remember the day that I visited it, having looked at pictures, floor plans, etc., and I realized that there's nothing that is more powerful than architecture when you experience it that way. And what I mean by that is architecture with a capital A. There's so many ideas here in this building that address society in 1930, about how people could live in a modern context, embracing modern ideas about space and living, and at the same time not have to abandon the culture where they came from. The way this building is situated in a garden is very interesting because in this particular picture, what you see is a two-story volume. How it presents itself on the street, however, is as a very simple, very modest little bungalow. There are many other things about the Villa Tugendhat that are really pretty incredible, and I think there is nobody who can be not impressed by it. But perhaps I should move on and only leave you with an impression of that chromed steel column that is just a little bit of a gesture towards modernism, because obviously it was completely unusual to have exposed steel in your living room. And this picture is wonderful in my mind because you can see a 19th century Persian rug that fits comfortably in a very modern environment. In my practice over the years, there are some issues that come up over and again. And when we started to work on our first monograph a few years ago, we initially thought, that is my team in my office, my partner Sarah Lopergolo, Lisa Green, and everybody else in the firm. When we started working on the book, what we thought about is that perhaps we should divide the chapters into the kind of, under a heading that informs the work and that creates the context for our work. What are they? Obviously, the context. Then there's the site. This particular house, or this cabin, I should say, is in Nova Scotia. And what better place to illustrate the notion of site, where you're surrounded by nothing but sky and rocks and water. Obviously, function is something that function and utilitarian purpose is something that everybody cites as their great inspirer. I must say that for us, function is really a very, very important aspect. I like to know what my clients want, not just in terms of what the program is, not just in terms of what your bathroom, how your bathroom is located to your bedroom, but really sort of the bigger picture. How do you expect to live? How do you expect to circulate in the house? How you circulate in a house is different from how your cousin Susie circulates in the house. And it's about finding that out, and that is what function really is. So, the clients are very important, and that is really directly what I was just saying. It's like, as an architect, I think you have to listen. You have to understand where somebody comes from. You have to listen. you have to hear, and then you have to conclude and include. And in my experience, the most interesting projects I've ever worked on are those where there's a client who participates, who in turn also listens, where there's real dialogue, real conversation, and real debate going on. Let's not forget how important structure is. The Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, a project for NYU in New York, was one such project where I had the opportunity to insert a completely new structure into an existing 19th century building. And that was very interesting because, for one, there was the technical aspect of getting it done, but secondly, it meant a great deal because it meant that we were introducing a new component in an old building, and that in itself was a message of its own. People always say, oh yeah, right, the materials you use. Nobody ever forgets that we like strongly variegated marbles in our bathrooms. Okay, this is a little bit outrageous, but materials are really just the last thing you remember, the last thing, the last sort of texture and color that sticks in your mind when you're thinking about somebody's work of architecture. I like materials. I love stone. However, when I'm asked about it, it's never the first thing I think about because I think that materials present themselves and they're not the first thing that makes architecture in my mind. Ultimately, you have to sort of develop a hierarchy in your own work. Certainly, there are people who can start with materials who say, I want to build a house of stone. For me, it's not like that. For me, there is a sort of party that makes part of it, that informs how the house sits, and all of those things come first. But materials, as I said, are the last thing you see and you think about, and so certainly they're important. I often start with volume, with scale, proportion, and try to define how in a given program, given a certain, figuring out all of the requirements, how you sort of eke good proportions out of an existing space, or how, when you are so lucky, how you can create wonderful proportions. It is the thing that I think, without words, informs how we feel in a space. Today, when I walked into the museum here, I thought, how wonderful. When you have that big central space, it's just an enormous pleasure to experience. And again, that is proportion. Proportion also, when you look at exterior volumes, in this particular case, a house in Cybertonic, we started to abstract the volumes and set them on top of one another, and how this house sits proportionally in the landscape is something that I'm particularly proud of, because it belongs there, it fits there. It's a completely modern house. There's certain abstracted geometries that come to play. But I think that what is remarkable about it is the sort of balanced and graceful proportion that the house presents to the landscape. Ultimately, last not least, is light. All of us, I think, are deeply influenced by light, by what light does to our spirit, how we experience space in light or lack thereof. And it's a real art to understand how to control it, how to guide it, and how to enjoy it, perhaps. So all of that is a way of introduction to a couple of projects that I want to talk about in a little bit more depth. One of them, perhaps you know, and perhaps you've been there, it's the Neue Galerie Museum for German and Austrian Art, which has now been a fixture in New York's museum landscape for about 10 years. I'm very proud of this building. It's the first public building that I worked on at a slightly larger scale. And I'm pleased to say that many experiences that we endured during the renovation have sort of led me to think, or led me to sort of develop my work further in the direction of working on art projects. When I first looked at the building, it was not in such terrible shape, and our client said, we just want a small renovation of a couple of galleries. Anyway, quickly it turned out that the museum was a 4-story building with 2 basements, and it was in terrible shape. There was only a minuscule little elevator. It's a building designed by Carrera Tastings in 1914, so it was very strictly marked. It's located, perhaps I said that, on the corner of 86th Street and 5th Avenue. And we learned that we had to introduce all new systems into this building. All new systems, not structural systems, HVAC and lighting, to live up to modern day strict museum standards. We wanted to do this without anybody knowing that that is what we had done. And sometimes you're blessed with ignorance when you start a project, because in retrospect I think, I don't know how we did that. It was pretty complicated and took a fairly long time, but some of the key interventions were to introduce a new elevator in the building that could both deal with handicap issues as well as transporting art through the floors. We changed certain things in the floor plan, and needless to say, when you're faced with a Carrera Tastings building, you start out being very, very respectful and you think everything is absolutely perfect. The longer you look, the more you realize they were no better than we were. I found a number of disparate arches, many things that didn't make sense, and I thought there must have been some young architect in that office that just didn't really know any better. Anyway, all joking aside, there is much substance that was really wonderful that you, of course, wanted to respect. Our modus operandi was to say the building should look as if it had never been anything other than what it is, except for where you couldn't avoid the interventions. And notably, that was the elevator, which there was really no other place to put it but right there, and you couldn't hide it, you couldn't say it's always been there. So we articulated it as a prominent element. I could talk for a long time about the building, but I will not explain too much about the floor plan, other than point out that there was a wonderful monumental staircase that goes from the ground floor to the first upper floor, and the upper floor then is the grand music room, a paneled, what was at one time a dining room, and the drawing room that was another sort of living space. And by way of explaining that this was at one time a private house, a private mansion, therefore it's called a house museum, even though at 23,000 square feet nowadays we don't so much think of it as a normal house. For a museum, however, it's very small. It was very difficult to accommodate the egress requirements. I already talked about the HVAC system, but all these other things that it takes to move people gracefully in and around the building and keep them safe were incredibly complicated. We required many sessions with the Commissioner of Buildings to sort of have certain allowances, because we simply couldn't change the site. There's any number of constraints that we had to live with, and it was sheer perseverance that allowed us for the museum to look the way it does today. You can see here in the section that there's a wonderful big skylight, which we glassed over. We put a second layer of glass over, which then became a glassed terrace on the top floor where the offices are. Space is tight, but we are proud that we used it well. This is what the building looked like when we first found it. And it has a little bit of an interesting history. In 1914, it was a merchant's house and a private residence eventually for Mrs. Vanderbilt. And eventually it was bought by the Evo Institute and was a Jewish center for communication, and it also housed the documents of the Nuremberg trial. So it was a very important building in a particular community. And when the Evo Institute decided to move out and sell the building to, that's a long story, to somebody who wanted to make a museum out of it, their first instinct was, let's not renovate, let's just clean the building out. So the first set of drawings I received said, take out monumental staircase. I was hired in time. This is a picture of the staircase. So there are many, many anecdotes that I could tell you, but what I'm particularly proud of is really the continuity of the vocabulary, that which is old together with that which was inserted and is new. For example, in the bookstore, we obviously reused all of the old bookcases in the old library, but we inserted a central book desk cash point that is very elegant, is very simple, very restrained, modernist metal detailing. This is the cafe. It's about as authentic an Austrian cafe, including the cakes, than you can imagine. And our client was very supportive of us doing many trips to Austria. I would encourage all of my clients to support this kind of research. Our client was very happy to make sure that we had measured every cafe banquette that litters Vienna. Here's a picture of the elevator, which I mentioned earlier. It's basically a shaft that's sheathed in white glass and presents itself as if it was a sort of pin that goes through the existing fabric. It's just a little bit of an anecdotal shot to show you how beautiful the building really is, and you can imagine that all of the very decorative plasterwork was difficult to restore. So there was an interaction with all of the craftsmen that was really interesting as well. I'm particularly proud of the glass ceiling that we inserted here in this so-called music room. Where there used to be mirrors on the walls, we inserted these Venetian stucco panels that are a very good background for the wonderful Austrian paintings like Klimt, Schiele, and others. The glass ceiling, of course, is a little bit of a reminder of the Vienna Secessionists. Here is the oak-paneled exhibition space in the adjacent room that I talked about earlier. When it came to designing vitrines, we were hard at work at doing very simple, modern, hard-edged vitrines. And then we came across this vitrine from the V&A in London, and all of a sudden it just fell into place. Those were the better vitrines. The reason I'm explaining that is because I think it always takes a little bit of a step back, where it's not always the best thing that you can design things yourself, but it's like the critical discourse with one's own instincts and one's own work. If it was up to me, I would design pretty much everything. But ultimately, then you recognize that's perhaps not so good. This is the third floor, which was the least well preserved and therefore had the most opportunity to actually create a very discreet background for temporary exhibitions. And this is what the museum looks like today, replete with handicap ramps on either side that the community board didn't want us to install, which is also a very interesting thing, because when you are in the service of doing something for a public building, you think that the community would support that. Anyway, ultimately they were pleased. This is a building that we completed relatively recently and is one of several sort of culture, art-related projects that I'm particularly proud of. This is a new building. It's located in West Chelsea, neighborhood in Manhattan, which is now home to the majority of galleries for contemporary art. Its history, however, is deeply rooted in the industrial. There used to be initially horse coaches, later car garages and car repair shops. This new building is the secondary exhibition space of a gallerist whose name is Barbara Gladstone. We had previously designed Barbara's gallery on 24th Street, and one day she called us up and she said, "You wouldn't believe it, I bought another building and we're going to use it for sculpture only." I did believe it, and I was extremely pleased because it meant building a new building in a neighborhood that is full of very nice industrial buildings that usually serve the purpose quite well. So here's a picture of what this building looked like before. It turned out that the building in the middle, this one here, is nicely wedged in between two very important contemporary art galleries here and here. And this building had been built fairly recently for the purposes of a music studio. Very little in that building was of use for us, and so once we analyzed what all of the requirements were, an elevator that had to carry, I think, 1,000 pounds and many other things, we realized that the best way to go about it was to actually tear the building down. And so here is how a new building sits in amongst its neighbors. Context here is sort of an interesting proposition because in some ways you can say it's a blank slate, you can do anything that you want to do. I always feel that there is plenty of reason to sort of respect urban context and understand that people walk up and down these streets in Chelsea as they go from gallery to gallery. So for me it was important to think that you were at once respectful of the traditional industrial context, address issues of contemporary architecture, but find ways to make a building tactile. I'm particularly proud of the sort of velvety, very strongly knit texture of the black brick, which is a sort of custom cut, handmade brick. So that was a bit of luxury in an otherwise very, very simple building. And its rather stern facade belies a phenomenal 50 by 50 square foot, 50 by 50 feet column-free space that is dedicated to mostly sculpture. And there is the one thing that we kept in the building. We kept a skylight that hugs the rear wall and brings a very moody, very unusual, very un-museum-like into this, after all, commercial space. And it is interesting for me working in the sort of art vernacular because having worked with so many different commercial art galleries, what you realize is in order to be specific about what you do, you have to understand what somebody's way of looking and dealing with art is really all about. This particular art dealer was interested in having the sort of atmospheric remnant of an industrial era quality of light, which for conservation purposes would be terrible. Plenty of daylight, plenty of hot sunlight pours into this space, but that's acceptable because works of art are only going to be there for a very short period of time, and there is a particular atmosphere that I think is quite marvelous. You can see that these sort of chromed objects in the space are really rather powerful. We've done a little bit of retail in the course of the office's history. I don't usually love working in retail because it is the opposite of permanence, which I'm kind of interested in. Anyway, we couldn't resist when Abercrombie & Fitch invited us to design their flagship stores. Never having done anything like that, I was a bit naive. I didn't really know who Abercrombie & Fitch was up until I got the catalog. I saw them. Very, very good-looking models. I couldn't stay away. What was really interesting about it, though, is that it addresses architecture in a completely different context. And there's the word context again. Yes, this is also about the client. The client was, in this particular instance, represented by the CEO of Abercrombie & Fitch, who's very specific and very clear ideas about how they sell their product. Interesting for me is the fact that this product is very simple. It's a couple of t-shirts and shorts. And how do you show them? What makes you sell t-shirts and shorts? Somehow or other, the company, long before we were involved with them, had already developed a sort of cult-like behavior. They worked on what our contemporary culture is all about with music. They sort of wanted to create this club-like atmosphere. At the same time as they wanted to have this club-like atmosphere, though, which is really just for young people. I don't know any of you who've ever been in an Abercrombie Fitch store, most likely will have complained about it being incredibly loud and incredibly dark. And for some reason, your teenage children all want to run there and spend a considerable amount of money, no less. But the thing that was interesting for us was really that the company was also interested in an architectural identity. And what they understood as their architectural identity, we convinced them to say what you have to do is you have to look at the place where you're building. The first project we did for them was in New York City at the corner of 55th Street and 5th Avenue, in a building that formerly had a Fendi store on the corner. And the two lower floors of the building were clad with travertine in wild shapes and forms, and made for a very distinct facade along Fifth Avenue. What I thought was that they really wanted to return this 1955 very elegant, very modern, simple building back to its former self. And so we essentially redesigned the facade in order to be part of the overall building. I was very pleased to be able to convince my client of concepts of architectural integrity. And for some time we worked with them. And in every location, whether it was in New York, in London, in Paris, or in Tokyo, they allowed us to understand where the buildings came from and to sort of make the spaces what they should be according to their locale. That does not mean that the interior vocabulary changed. No, they as a company have an identity. They certainly stuck to their dark, loud ways. However, when you look carefully, I think there are any number of really wonderful details, such as the backlit staircase. There's some really beautiful ironwork, and it was an interesting, if initially unlikely, pairing between client and architect. And I have to say, I'm very pleased that we had the opportunity to do some very fine quality work that you can really only see when the lights were turned off. However, one of the last things we did for Abercrombie recently is a brand new tower in Ginza in Tokyo. Without irony, it didn't shake recently. But it was quite something to learn about the earthquake requirements that came to pass when we built this building, and to understand now how incredibly important they really are. Not to dwell on that subject, it was a pleasure to be able to do this building and find a way to have an appropriate language which is entirely modern and simple. You refer to it a little bit as a sequence building on a very small footprint. And that is what's interesting about this building in the first place, is that the footprint is so small that it required altogether 14 floors, of which 12 are dedicated to the retail. Now, this footprint is so small that it's barely enough room for a staircase that goes 12 stories up in the air. It's completely open, and people actually use the building vertically, which I think is really a marvelous idea. So there's on each floor only a very small room that otherwise would be distributed horizontally. It's really sort of reverse efficiency, but it works wonderfully, and seeing it full of young people who are sort of streaming up and down the stairs, and you can see in the picture that there's a really rather fantastic perspective there. Another tall building, even though it's not really all that tall, is a residence that we designed for a family who usually lives in Europe and only uses this house some 3 months of the year in Dunton Hot Springs near Telluride in Colorado. I spent a lot of time in this place, and it took some time to find the right spot on this marvelous property of this particular locale. Ultimately, we found that there was only a small parcel of land that allowed us to sort of fully capture the views. Any number of reasons that had to do with foundations and so on and so forth that are too difficult to get into prompted us to use this particular site. And 4,500 square feet in the context of a small town which is dedicated to gold mining, or who was dedicated rather, it's a ghost town now, which has been converted into a really wonderful rural resort. Anyway, so this house for a family, 4,500 square feet. If you do that horizontally, it sits in sharp contrast and in opposition to otherwise small log cabins that create the landscape. So we decided to go vertically. Very unusual. It's probably one of the very few communities in America where you can do such a thing, because normally zoning regulations prevent you from building 4 stories, 5 stories up in the air. But so it turns out that in this particular community, there were no zoning laws. And so we built what in New York City would really just be a townhouse-sized building. But in this particular neighborhood, or in this particular landscape, I should say, it really looks like a tower. You can see in this drawing that it's a very small footprint. So what's wonderful is the orientation that goes actually in a northern direction changes from floor to floor. All of the principal rooms are facing the view. There's a kitchen dining area on the ground floor, and the building is held together, or linked, the floors are linked by this very open staircase. And we opened up the views by sort of saying everything that goes toward the view embraces the landscape. And it's a wonderful experience when you're in the building as you go up to sort of have a slightly changing perspective. One of the objectives was to use local materials. Again, the materials came last, I swear. No, they didn't in this case. But I am very proud to say that we found a vernacular that is entirely appropriate for that neighborhood, and that is at once completely modern. It's not one of those country cabins that is on steroids. And it's truly a very difficult thing to do, because the requirements of houses nowadays are so much, the square footage requirements are so much bigger than what they were at one time. And so it takes a great deal of thinking and deliberating about what the best vernacular for that is. One sort of interesting aspect of it is that I felt, because the clients are only there for 3 months of the year, I wanted the building completely protected, both from sun as well as from unwelcome visitors, such as squirrels, mice, and the occasional cowboy shooting at the building. But so we introduced these shutters, and the building can literally be completely shut down, which makes it very efficient in every respect, among other things. Sustainable ideas about using local materials, about being able to make the building practically completely empty, so to speak, was very important to us. And that's the view. It's not shabby. Here are a couple of pictures of the interiors. Again, as I explained earlier, what makes the building sort of link together is this very prominent staircase that winds itself on one side. And it's very important to think that the going up and down is it's the same kind of circulation as going horizontally. And so there is ways to sort of say the proportions of the tread to the riser are such that it's very agreeable to walk up and down the building. I'm showing this picture here because it references that we also have a furniture company, and whenever we have a residential client, we foist our furniture on them. All joking aside, this furniture company is an interesting side event that happened in my career, and is testimony to how you think, oh, it's got to be rather easy to design the chair and have it manufactured. In fact, it's been a long time, and it's very complicated, very different activity from architecture. The design of a piece of furniture in some ways is perhaps not so different. For me, it's always about proportion, it's about utilitarian purpose. Oftentimes when we design residences for collectors, I sort of think that you need some background furniture that's discreet, that's simple, that's modern. However, putting it into production and making sure that it really fits all of the requirements that one naturally assumes of furniture is way more complicated than meets the eye. Here is the final last image of the ground floor of that house, where you're really part of the landscape. And in both seasons, there are 4 seasons even in Colorado, but the 2 major seasons are summer and winter, obviously, when it's very, very covered in snow. And in both cases, having this inclusive exterior is absolutely marvelous. Finally, at night in the snow, in the very background, you see that little town called Dunton Springs. The building that Beverly talked about, 200 11th Avenue, is just recently been finished. It's an apartment condo building that we worked on starting in 2007. And it's an interesting story. We'll try to not elaborate too long. It's located in a spot where if you build tall, you have truly magnificent views. When the client came to us, they said, here is the problem. We have a building, we want to build a building that has a very small footprint, but has limited FAR, which allowed us to build 60,000 square feet and 250 feet up in the air. So basically, the amount of square footage available was disproportionately small to the amount of height that we could use. The aim was, from the get-go, to do a building that was unusual, that would appeal to people who, had seen many other things in and around New York at a moment in time, 2007, when there was luxury building in abundance. And we won a small competition by arguing that the thing that would make this building really interesting is to say, let's find context for the neighborhood. Let's make a building that actually belongs here. Well, this is the neighborhood. It's not so great, right? Perhaps this wasn't really something that we wanted to relate to. But there are plenty of other things in the neighborhood that are wonderful. such as the historic Lehigh building, which is only a few blocks farther up and which many of you probably have seen. There's a sort of industrial vernacular that fits very nicely with the art community that lives there now. So what we decided to do is to sort of find any number of inspirations, the industrial vocabulary on one hand, but also sort of texture and shape that comes from nature and geometry. And so we designed a building that lives with a 60 feet high street wall. And we used a material that I'm very enamored with. Here I go again, as if I started with the material. Really didn't, but eventually when it came to choosing materials, once we understood that there is a street wall that needs to be filled in, that needs to be substantial and massive, and then the sort of taller tower that grows out of that, but we decided to use terracotta, which is a material that's been around for thousands of years, but nowadays is rarely used in this application. It's a masonry application rather than being hung from the steel frame. What I think this does is any number of things. It conveys an idea of substance. I think there is a tactility in the color and the shape and the form that's really inspiring, for lack of a better word. And so here it is. You can see the sort of industrial references with the mullioned windows. Don't you just want to touch that building? What's really remarkable about it, and Beverly's already talked about it, is that in discussions with the client, we identified that a building like that, a luxury condominium in New York, has to have a garage. What we didn't have is the opportunity to go into the ground. Because the building's located close to the river, it would have been very difficult to dig into the ground for a garage. But also, the footprint of the site is so small, 7,500 square feet only, that ultimately we realized a parking garage would have to be four stories tall in order to allow for turning radius, etc. And so the idea of using a car elevator was really a pretty simple idea to come up with. What I didn't realize when this idea was articulated was how difficult it was to put it into reality, because every community board that was available was there to criticize us. The city has been rather less than supportive of parking spaces, and safety and security measures had to be proven and put into place to make this happen. Among other things, and you perhaps don't know that, among other things, it's also a costly thing to do because it cost us floor area ratio, meaning valuable living space was now dedicated to a parking space, when otherwise it would have been something that you can insert in the building and not have to account for, if that makes any sense. What happens is you drive up 11th Avenue, where the arrow is, you drive into the elevator, and next thing you know, you're up on your floor, you drive backwards and park your car and go into your apartment. Here you can see it in section. If you love your car, and if you don't, you have a place to put it. I think what's also remarkable about this building is the sectional reality of the double high floors that I alluded to earlier. Because we had so much height, we were able to make spaces that in each apartment there's at least one space that's 24 feet high. And that's a difficult thing to design for. I'm very sensitive to dimensions and to proportions, as I've mentioned a few times. Making a room that's 24 feet tall is a difficult thing because it quickly loses intimacy and it's difficult to direct the light, etc. But in this particular instance, we were able to sort of insert a staircase that sort of dynamically leads you to the upper floor. And the thing that I am most proud of, more proud than the garage, is actually the proportions of the space and how tightly the apartments are designed. All of them are duplex units that are intersecting with one another. It's a little bit difficult to understand, but believe me. Actually, what happens is because they're intersecting, what is the public floor on one level is the private floor for the other, and therefore it's possible that each floor gets one garage. So you can sort of see that here. This is the lower floor in one apartment, and it's the upper floor in the apartment below. And so all of the apartments have really wonderful views of the Hudson River. And I think the floor plans hopefully speak for themselves, are very tightly designed and really sort of elegantly detailed. But again, I think that it's all about the layering. You develop an idea, and the idea of having the garage and having the intersecting duplexes is what comes way ahead of all of the things that ultimately you will remember, which are the materials and the details. Here are some renderings from the. This is what it looks like today, and on to the last project. This is a project that is under construction. We've been working for a couple of years now on a recycling facility in Brooklyn, which is particularly exciting because it exceeds anything we've done in scale by a lot. This is the location. It's a project that's located in Brooklyn. Oh, here it is. There it is. It's the pier on the edge of the Gowanus Canal, facing New York Harbor in the most dramatic way. It's a project that a private company, SIMS Middle Management, is in liaison with the Department of Sanitation. It's obviously city land, and the recycling facility is there to handle all of the incredible event, because in a very short amount of time, the city will facility will literally handle all of their metal, glass, plastic recycling. There's a picture of the site. It's located on Pier 30 in Sunset Park in Brooklyn. And it's like I said, a public-private partnership. Originally, we were hired also as a result of a small competition to design only one small aspect of the project, which was the administration and visitor center, and perhaps advise on the materials for the shell of the industrial buildings. Never having done a building like that, barely being able to spell the word recycling, I thought that that was a rather large task. Quickly, however, when we started looking at the plans that the engineering architect provided us, we realized you really have to understand how this works. And next thing you know, you're terribly critical of what they did. And we were able to convince our client that, in fact, it was rather more important to think about the building or the project as a holistic project. So the first thing that we did is we devised a master plan. This is a little bit of context. It's in this really wonderful industrial neighborhood in Sunset Park, where there are many of these early 19th century industrial buildings that are just about all empty nowadays. The first thing that we did is we devised a master plan. It was clear and evident that the tipping building and processing building had to be located at this corner of the site, because It was the only place where barges, where barges could arrive for loading and unloading, and a railway could enter the site, and trucks could come in, deliver, and pick up. But that was clear. However, how the volumes stood in relationship to one another, and how the visitors and administration building should be located in relationship to the building wasn't at all clear. We also made it very clear that we wanted the building to be situated in a sort of green environment. Needless to say, the city and the client were very pleased about that. So we separated circulation, pedestrian, and it's not just pedestrian, it's like people who work in the facility who park their car or arrive by bicycle, as well as visitors' buses, drive in a separate lane in a tree-lined parking lot, whereas large trucks come here, get weighed, and continue on their way. The processes now seem pretty simple to me, but initially they weren't. Initially it was hard to understand how all of these different kinds of circulation would overlap and interact, or rather be separated. It was perhaps for us and for the client the best experience that we embraced that there was a very strict economic reality to it. You can imagine that design is not terribly important for most people bringing in recycled garbage. So one of the things that made this a little bit more important and a little bit more viable was that the city in this neighborhood really wants to see architecture, and in this invigorated neighborhood was very willing to support our design. We presented to a group that's called the Public Design Commission, who gave us an award for this facility even before it's built. Never seen such a thing. Part of it, though, was to understand what is the vocabulary, the industrial vocabulary of a pre-engineered building that usually is just used for big box construction, Walmarts and those large shopping mall type things. What we did here is we used the kind of construction that's inherent in the big box building, but inverted the structure in such a way that it's visible on the outside. Well, many layers of function come together here again. And another aspect that for us was very important is to accommodate the visitor center, where school classes on a daily basis will come in buses, bring kids in that can then go across the bridge, see how the recycling is done, how the processing is working. And so having these completely opposite components of the project were one of the aspects that I liked most about it. And it's really phenomenal to see now that it's under construction how it's coming together. You can see there's this roof that's called, that is over a concrete foundation so that the barges can go in, and this thing is called the eBuff. It's an enclosed barge unloading facility. I knew it. The materials are going to be very simple, galvanized metal siding and galvanized steel structure. So the building will sort of shimmer in this soft gray, located in a beautiful water and green environment. I'm incredibly excited for you to come to Brooklyn and see it when you see it. It's discreetly lit at night. And now they're building it. Thank you very much.
See a lot in Colorado, so I'm quite interested in that area. It looks so beautiful. Is there an elevator?
There is. It's a residential elevator, which is so slow that the clients put a chair in it because. But we figured sometimes people break a leg in that neighborhood.
The building in New York on 11th Avenue with the elevator for the automobiles, I see a practical problem. In the morning, everybody's going to work. How does that work?
It's a good question. The studies prove that for the most part in New York people don't use their car. They just have it nearby. Secondly, it's only 12 floors of car elevators. So ultimately what's going to happen is, like, if the worst thing that happens is that there's another 11 cars ahead of you, okay, that's not good, but that's likely not to happen because there'll be lots of people who are there that use this building as a pied-à-terre rather than as a full-time living thing. And we've sort of studied the law of average and came out to saying, like, 5-10 minutes is the most that you wait.
I'm curious about floor to ceiling heights in the Colorado house. One exhibit had a piano to relay. And you mentioned 24-foot clear at 11th Avenue. But what the customary floor to ceiling height?
The customary floor height is 11 feet. It's 11 feet clear. Yeah, that is what that is. And that's it's actually the relationship between those two ceiling heights that makes the 24-foot agreeable, because it's not like you have this enormously tall floor and then a hunched over situation as you go into your kitchen. No, it's pretty gracious. It is correct that the ceiling heights in the Pica house are not all the same. The public floors are tall. They're also 11 feet. Whereas the bedroom floors, that makes it last two floors, are just under 10 feet. 9 foot 11 or something like that. It's easy to remember these things.
Other questions?
So you talked a lot about proportions and scale in your work, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about jumping the scale from your urban work to the recycling facility. It's an unusual scale for someone experienced when you live in New York, and it seems unusual for your work as well.
Yes, agreed on all fronts. And it's very intimidating. I think that it caused me plenty of anxiety, I must admit. Eventually I realized that it is like everything else. It's like you have to think about it, you have to play around with it, you have to build the models, the drawings, you have to go around and experience other spaces that are tall, see what the relationships are, understand how a freestanding tall structure is different from something that is part of a tighter urban context. It's also why I showed the furniture, because it's from the very small to the very large that the considerations are very similar. Consideration is really the right word. It's not something that you take for granted. And I often perceive in contemporary architecture that there's wildly gestural, huge spaces being created that sort of seem to lack a desire for the human body as it fits into these structures. And that's very much on the forefront of our minds. Thank you.
If you're comfortable, would you share some of your personal experiences in becoming a female architect, considering it's Women's History Month? I'm just very curious, did you have mentors? Were your parents architects? Did you always build things as a child? If you don't mind.
I don't mind. It makes me laugh. Because my father is an architect, and when I grew up, I thought the last thing I had to do was be an architect. For one, I was, like many teenagers, really lazy, and I saw my father working all the time. And secondly, we never had money, and I didn't like that. And thirdly, it just wasn't something that I really thought about. And I didn't know what else to do. And to begin with, I didn't get into architecture school in Germany because my high school average wasn't all that great. So then I thought, what am I going to do? My father encouraged me. I wanted to go study interior design with my best friend and live in Munich, where the weather is always nice. And it sounded like if she liked it, I would like it. Then she decided to do something else, get married or something. And I was faced with the decision, what do I do now? My father said, if you want to be an interior designer, so be it. That's what I do most of my life, but really you should study architecture because you can do interior design as an architect, but you can't do architecture as an interior designer. That made sense to me. I applied to architecture school, didn't get in, I practiced on the construction site where I learned masonry and all sorts of things. And eventually I applied to Pratt in New York, and luck had it that they wanted me. So once I started to study architecture, there was no going back. And I certainly don't regret it, but it's not for the faint-hearted.
The recycling facility, you were quick to point out not just only where the barges come in, but also the parking, the access for bikers as well as the buses, and so it implies that you expect sort of non-barge activity to be, you expect visitation. Was that part of the, you said it was also a public-private project, so was that part of the program that it's also sort of the park-like aspects were written into the program, or was that something that you brought to the program?
Very good question. I think to begin with, the program wasn't that clear. They knew what they had to do to satisfy their agreement with the city. When I say they, I'm talking about the client, SIMS Metal Management. They knew what they had to do to satisfy their agreement with the city, namely take care of curbside recycling, which comes onto the site via rail, truck, and barge, and it leaves the site in the same way. Something might come in by barge, leave by rail, and however many possibilities there are. They also knew that they wanted a visitor center. They had identified that themselves, and that's something that the city encourages very much. Everything else was really developed. The sort of idea that you can actually create a park-like setting certainly came from us, and I enjoyed this sort of landscaping aspect very much. Rather than hiring a landscape architect, they said, well, can't you do it? And again, little did I know. I said, yes.
It's kind of inverting your work with museums and galleries, so this idea of working with the public coming into the space, we're kind of using now this whole landscaped piece of property as sort of your museum.
It's a little bit true. I think that is a nice way of putting it. And it gives me an opportunity to say the thing that is really, truly the most satisfying about architecture is doing work for the public. And in every respect, where you interact with the street, where people enter buildings. I have done many, many private residences in my life, and I enjoy doing that and the interaction with the client and the specificity that allows for. But there's nothing more satisfying than doing something that really makes a difference in people's lives, and whether that's in a museum or in a facility like that. It's really very, very rewarding.
On that same recycling project, can you, did you have to deal at all with climate change and the rising level of the water? And can you say how the design deals with that?
The truth is I didn't, because there are marine engineers who deal with that. But it is certainly one of the big considerations that go into all of the calculations. We directly didn't work with the engineers, but we were privy to some of the early conversations. And the city was very much against dredging, so dredging was kept to a minimum. But on the other hand, there's like all sorts of opposing departments in the city that sort of work against one another. But climate change is, of course, our big issue. And I can't tell you too much more about that other than that the water tables change, and so we had to sort of build into them, not we, they, the engineers, are very conscious about that.
Let's take one last question.
I don't have a question, but I just want to tell you how much I've enjoyed the Neue Galerie. From the entrance to the beautiful staircase going up to the exhibits and all the details. And I just thought it was wonderful. Felt like I was being transported. And of course the climax was the cafe with all its details, including the waiters. My son was so impressed. The towel over their arm. He just thought that was delightful. Excellent. The food was excellent. So the whole experience was just wonderful. And the architecture to the food.
Well, it was, again, another one of those projects where there was so much collaborative effort involved in it, working with the curator, with the president, with the directors, down to the people who run the cafe, that everybody learned from everybody all the time. And it was the disposition to be open to that, to collect it, to disseminate it, and to simply get the best out of it. And I'm always pleased when I go that they run this museum like a jewelry box. Everything is always taken care of. They're the most wonderful, careful exhibitions. And it never ceases to amaze me how something that you have worked on gets better with age rather than worse. So it's very satisfying.
Well, I'm afraid we've come to the end of the evening. Please join me in thanking Annabelle